The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 1, Dragon and Thief. Chapter 13.
Shall we leave?
Dracos murmured from beside him. No, Jack muttered back. He'd already seen how fast the drunk Wistwak could move. The group inside didn't seem likely to be that handicapped, which meant that outrunning them was out of the question. Now, too late, he remembered that the Wistwaki he and Uncle Virgil had conned all those years ago had been rather elderly. Maybe that was the only reason the two of them had made it out of that scam alive. Preenov took a long step out onto the balcony.
Who are you?
He demanded, his voice sounding like sticks clattering together. Did that mean he was getting angry? Jack wished he knew. Who am I? He echoed, stalling for time as he tried desperately to remember something, anything about bonding ceremonies. Uncle Virgil had had him read up on Wistwaki culture in general for that scam, but this particular subject hadn't really come up. They were sort of like human weddings, he vaguely remembered, but a lot more rowdy. One of the articles he'd read had compared them to a combination of wedding, pie-eating contest, and carnival. They also usually covered a 2 to 3 block area, with all of the happy couple's neighbors involved in the ceremonies in some way. No wonder the Brumga had scoffed at the idea of Jack being able to disappear into this neighborhood. If they got mad at him crashing their party, there would be an awful lot of Wistwaki he would have to run through before he reached someplace safe. But even as that depressing thought occurred to him, the key word clicked. Carnival! Who am I? Jack repeated, drawing himself up to his full height. Why, I'm one of the entertainers, of course. The great Jack O'Lantern, here to amaze and enchant and astound the young ones. I trust I'm not late? Preenov had been starting to take another step toward them. Now, though, he paused.
I didn't hire any humans,
he said. Not specifically, Jack said. The agency sent me over. He reached down and patted Dracos's head. Jack O'Lantern and his amazing electromechanical assistant, Dracos. He frowned. Surely you've heard of us. The Skyway Pavilion on Skrin Trail? I was one of the star performers there only 3 years ago.
There are so many,
Preenov said, waving a hand in a vague gesture as he stepped to one side.
Very well. Come inside.
Thank you, Jack said, bowing from the waist. A moment while I get Dracos reset. He leaned over and reached under Dracos's neck. I hope you know
what you are doing,
Dracos murmured. Me too, Jack whispered. Just play off my cues, and remember, you're supposed to be a mechanical robot. Can you sing or dance or anything? Dracos turned his head slightly to gaze directly into Jack's eyes. Jack swallowed. Those green eyes did not look very friendly at the moment.
Dance,
he repeated ominously. No, of course not, Jack said hastily. That's okay. We'll skip the dance.
Are you ready?
Preenov asked. Ready, willing, and able, Jack said, straightening up. Lead the way. The Wistwak turned and walked back into the room. Putting on his most confident smile, Jack followed.
The whelps are there,
Preenov said, pointing at the outer circle, a ring of short Wistwaki Jack hadn't been able to see from the balcony.
We will see your performance now.
Certainly, Jack said, forcing his smile to stay in place as he felt sweat gathering on his forehead. He had assumed the youngsters would be off in another room somewhere, away from the main festivities. Clearly, the carnival atmosphere was for the adults, too. Which meant a bigger audience, a more discerning audience, an audience that might decide to tear him into pieces if they didn't like the show. Terrific. Good evening, all, he said cheerfully, bowing to the room in general. My name is Jack O'Lantern, and this is my amazing electromechanical assistant, Dracos. Say hello to the folks, Dracos. Dracos drew himself up as if he was going to refuse to play along for this charade. Jack held his breath. The dragon dropped his head and neck nearly to the floor in a stylized bow of his own, his tail arching up over his head.
Good evening, all,
he said. Holding the pose, he fluttered the tip of his tail as if waiting.
And a special good evening to the whelps,
he added. There was an almost human giggle from the outer circle, and Jack started to breathe again. That's Dracos, he said as Dracos straightened up. Did I mention he's my amazing electromechanical assistant?
Yes,
one of the whelps obligingly called.
He looks real,
one of the others added. Of course he's real, Jack said. A real robot. Maybe later, if you're good, I'll let one of you push some of his buttons.
Me,
the first whelp yipped.
No, me,
someone else insisted. Later, Jack reminded them. Don't worry, there's enough of him to go around. There was just a hint of a growl from Dracos, but the dragon didn't say anything. Now, I need someone to go find me a few things, Jack continued, stepping over to the refreshment table set out along the wall beside the door to the balcony. One of the serving plates was loaded with raw fruits and vegetables. I'll need a deck of ordinary playing cards, 3 opaque cups, those are cups you can't see through, and some string or thin rope, and 3 coins, any size.
I'll get the cards,
one of the whelps said, scrambling to his feet. 2 others were right behind him, scattering to different parts of the house.
You do not have your own equipment?
Neoff asked. I have my amazing electromechanical assistant, Dracos, Jack reminded him. He reached to the fruit plate and selected an apple, a pear-shaped white fruit, and a polka-dotted thing the size and shape of a small zucchini. For everything else, I prefer to borrow from my audience. He smiled out at the crowd. After all, anyone can do tricks with special cards, can't they?
Show us some tricks,
one of the whelps called impatiently. Man, I don't know if I can, Jack said with mock uncertainty. He stepped away from the table and tossed the apple up into the air. The zucchini followed, and then the pear, then the apple again. It had been a long time since he juggled, but apparently the skill hadn't gone rusty. Maybe you can help me think of some, he added. Someone giggled. Jack tried varying the pattern a little. Someone giggled again. He stole a glance away from the flying fruit, wondering what he was doing that was so funny. The audience wasn't looking at him. They were looking behind him, and all the children were giggling now. Carefully, keeping his eyes mostly on his juggling, Jack threw a quick glance to each side. Neoff was nowhere to be seen. Could he be coming up behind Jack? With a serving knife from the table, maybe? A drop of sweat trickled down his back. He hadn't been invited here, after all. He'd crashed this ceremony, and there were plenty of species in the Orion Arm who would consider that a good enough reason to cut such an intruder into fish food. Some of those species might even laugh and applaud and giggle while it was being done. Did the Wistwaki think that way? He didn't have the foggiest idea. More to the point, did Neoff think that way? He didn't know that either. All he knew was that the giggling was getting louder and that the adults were smiling too. Keeping the fruit in the air, wondering how fast he could go for his tangler if he had to, he turned his head quickly to the right. It wasn't far enough to see what was behind him, but it was far enough to spot Neoff standing by the balcony door. He wasn't moving toward Jack, and there was certainly no knife or other weapon in his hand. And like the other adults, he was smiling. Jack focused back on his juggling, thoroughly confused now. Could there be another Wistwaki back there? The drunk from the balcony, maybe? Probably not. Then how about a Wistwak sneaking up on him from the left? That was possible. Again, Jack twisted his head quickly to the side, this time to his left. Again, it wasn't far enough to see directly behind him, but again, there was no threat anywhere that direction that he could see. So what were they all giggling at? He'd tried to play it subtle, but there was nothing for it now but to go obvious. Slowly, still keeping the fruit circling through the air in front of him, he turned around. Dracos was lying on his back on the floor between Jack and the table, his neck and tail curled upward like a mismatched set of parentheses, busily juggling 5 of the apples back and forth between his 4 paws. Jack let out a quiet huff of relief. So no one was trying to murder him after all. A second later, the relief vanished, rolled over by a flood of annoyance. What did Dracos think he was doing, upstaging him that way? How dare he? He let his hands come to a halt, catching the pieces of fruit as they fell, and stood there glaring at the dragon. What was he going to do, he wondered desperately, now that Dracos had ruined his act? Dracos kept juggling another couple of seconds, then suddenly seemed to realize that Jack was watching him. Letting out a guilty squeak, he quickly stopped, catching one of the apples in each paw. The fifth apple was still soaring high overhead. Arching his neck, he caught it neatly in his teeth. Behind Jack came a clatter of the finger snapping that was the Wistwacky version of applause. Dracos held his pose, blinking at Jack like a kid caught raiding the cookie jar. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Jack realized the dragon hadn't ruined the act at all. In fact, he'd made it far better than anything Jack could ever have come up with on his own. With a flourish, he turned back to face the Wistwacky. "My amazing electromechanical assistant, Dracos!" he announced, waving a hand back at Dracos. He stepped back to the table and returned his borrowed fruit to the plate, then turned to Dracos and gave a slight nod. Draco understood. One at a time, in rapid succession, he tossed Jack the apples he was holding in his paws. Jack caught each in his left hand, tossing it in turn to his right hand, and set it back on the plate. Last, Draco spat the fifth apple. Jack caught it and stopped, reacting as if it was wet with saliva. He looked closely at it, made an exaggerated yucky face that got him more giggles from the whelps, and tossed it back to Dracos. The dragon caught it in his mouth, bounced it around to each of his paws, then tossed it back to his mouth. A flash of sharp teeth, and the apple was gone. "My amazing electromechanical assistant Dracos must have skipped lunch," Jack said dryly over the finger-snapping applause. "Now who's got that deck of cards?"